America before America. No one arrived first, but many came before. Long, long before. Before maps spoke English, before European flags were stabbed into a land they did not understand like knives, America was already beating. It breathed through the voices, the rituals, and the dreams of thousands of nations that do not appear in school textbooks. And yet, they were there. Some dared to build cities larger than those of London. Others wove alliances more complex than any European treaty. All of them left a mark that, although many tried to erase it, still pulses beneath the asphalt, the highways, and the modern monuments. What we now call the United States was for millennia a vast mosaic of cultures that adapted, evolved, and expanded with an intelligence that is rarely acknowledged. While empires in the Old World competed over seas and gold, here flourished civilizations that built without iron, calculated without written numbers, and governed without absolute kings. And it was not a single people, nor a single model of society. We are speaking of thousands of human groups with languages, worldviews, and social structures as different as the ice of the Arctic and the desert of Arizona. In the Mississippi Valley, for example, a city rose that for centuries was larger than any city in Western Europe. Cahokia, with its enormous earthen pyramids, its network of roads, ceremonial plazas, and a population that exceeded 40,000 inhabitants, was the beating heart of a civilization that blended religion, commerce, and astronomy into a way of life we still do not fully understand. Over time, this ceremonial center attracted peoples from different regions, traded across unimaginable distances, and organized rituals in which the cosmos took center stage. Cahokia was not an exception. It was part of a cultural network that connected Great Lakes, forests, and plains long before anyone had heard of Europe. Farther west, in the reddish arid lands we now associate with Arizona and New Mexico, flourished peoples who built entire cities within canyons. The Anasazi, ancestors of today's Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples, constructed multi-room, multi-story structures carved in stone and adobe, some hidden among cliffs, others exposed to the open sky. Their mastery of agriculture in such an extreme environment, their astronomical knowledge, and their ability to build trade networks stretching hundreds of kilometers reveal a sophistication that was ignored or outright minimized for far too long. In the Northeast, in the dense forests that once covered much of what is now the state of New York and neighboring regions, one of the most complex political structures on the entire continent was organized: the Iroquois Confederacy. 5 nations, later 6, that achieved something few human societies ever have: a political alliance based on the balance of power, decision-making by consensus, and the existence of common laws between different peoples. Their great law of peace, a kind of oral constitution, would later inspire the founding fathers of the United States themselves, although few dared to acknowledge it openly. Their society valued eloquence, memory, ancestral wisdom, and the role of women was central. They chose the leaders, participated in fundamental decisions, and preserved the legacy of past generations. On the Central Plains, tribes like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Comanche developed lifestyles entirely adapted to the hunting of bison. But here it is worth breaking another myth, that of the Native American as a frozen figure in time, nomadic and savage. Nothing could be further from the truth. These societies were mobile, yes, but highly structured, with defined roles, their own laws, initiation rites, shamans, diplomacy, and war strategies. Their mobility was not a sign of backwardness, but a full adaptation to a vast and challenging ecosystem. The peoples of the Northwest, along the Pacific coast, such as the Tlingit, the Haida, and the Chinook, lived in hierarchical societies with complex rituals of exchange like the potlatch, where power was celebrated by giving away wealth. Their totems were not mere decorations, they were living libraries, sacred genealogies, narratives of lineages and mythologies passed down from generation to generation. They carved wood with a mastery that still astonishes today and maintained a balance with their environment that ensured abundance without destruction for centuries. None of this was accidental. Each society had developed, over thousands of years, a deep understanding of the natural world, the rhythms of the earth, the sky, and the human body. Their languages, many of them now extinct or in danger of disappearing, were maps of thought. Some had dozens of words to describe water. Others conceived time in ways that challenge Western logic. And in all of them, the land was not a possession, but a living being that had to be respected, cared for, and, if necessary, feared. This respect for the land did not prevent war. Pre-Columbian societies also had conflicts, broken alliances, bloody battles. But even war followed rules. There was protocol, diplomacy, honor, and there was also the possibility of reconciliation. Some peoples, like the Cherokees, developed complex systems of justice, with proportional punishments, public trials, and forms of mediation. Others, like the Apaches, based leadership on merit and courage proven in battle, not on inheritance or lineage. For thousands of years, these peoples lived, evolved, and created masterpieces of organization and spirituality without the world knowing of their existence. When the first Europeans began arriving on Atlantic shores, what they found was not an empty land, nor a new world, as they called it. It was an ancient world, dense, contradictory, with centuries of history buried under every stone, every river, every hill. A continent with as many versions of humanity as there are landscapes within its borders. But the world they were about to encounter would change forever. Because although the land knew nothing of borders, those who arrived by ship brought them. And with them came property, the gold fever, broken treaties, and epidemics. The clash was not cultural, it was existential. And what was about to begin was not simply a new chapter. It was the rupture of a millennia-old timeline, the violent interruption of a story that, even today, is still searching to be told. Because to understand the United States, it is not enough to start in the year 1776, not even in the year 1607. One must begin earlier, much earlier. When drums still marked the cycles of the moon, when the smoke of tribal councils rose into the sky like a promise, and when America was already America, even if no one called it that yet. And while the ancient land began to tremble under foreign boots, the beginning of a radical transformation was taking shape. A struggle to dominate a continent that already had its rightful owners. The encounter that changed the world. There is no collision without consequences. When two worlds, unaware of each other's existence, finally brush against one another, the tremor can be felt for centuries. Such was the encounter between Europe and America, but calling it an encounter sounds innocent, almost poetic. In truth, it was an incursion, a storm that crossed oceans with full sails, overflowing ambition, and an ancient hunger that recognized no limits and no law higher than self-interest. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus did not arrive in America as someone entering untouched land. He landed on a continent that already had names, gods, cities, harvests, and roads. Columbus did not discover anything. He simply arrived. But in doing so, he opened an irreversible rift. Even though he never set foot on what we now call the United States, his voyage triggered a chain reaction that would devastate entire cultures and transform the fate of the planet. The expeditions that followed Columbus were driven by European crowns that, beyond the religious language of evangelization, sought resources, roots, and domination. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Netherlands. Each wanted a portion of that promised treasure, that new world they spoke of with feverish desire. But that land they coveted was neither empty nor new. and those who lived on it were not waiting to be saved. On the eastern coast of what would become North America, indigenous peoples had already been trading with one another since ancient times. Some lived in large agricultural villages, others in mobile clans adapted to their environments. They had diplomacy, warrior traditions, and deep, sophisticated relationships with the land. But against what was coming, neither their knowledge nor their bravery was enough. The enemy did not always arrive with weapons. It arrived in the air, in the saliva, in the skin. Epidemics were the most lethal, invisible weapon of the colonial process. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases for which the bodies of the Americas had no defenses. Within decades, entire populations vanished without a single sword being drawn. Some studies estimate that over 90% of the original inhabitants died from diseases introduced by Europeans, often without ever seeing a foreign face. The geography changed. Forests grew where cities once stood. Roads disappeared, and myths began to cover what pain could not explain. But colonization was not only biological death, it was also cultural imposition. Wherever they arrived, Europeans built missions, forts, ports, and above all, narratives. The map filled with new names: St. Augustine, Jamestown, New Amsterdam. And with those names came new rules: private property, hierarchies, organized religion, resource exploitation, and territorial control. What had once been common land now had owners. What had once been spirit was now sin. What had once been community was now organized according to the logic of production. The Spanish were the first to establish permanent settlements on what is now United States territory, founding cities in present-day Florida, Texas, and New Mexico. The Franciscan missions advanced with the cross in one hand and the sword in the other. Indigenous communities were relocated, indoctrinated, and often enslaved. The so-called reduction was not just geographic, it was spiritual. Languages were banned, rituals were punished, and identity was erased under the excuse of eternal salvation. At the same time, the French explored the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, forging alliances with some native nations in exchange for furs and protection. Their model was less aggressive than that of the Spanish, but not out of benevolence. It was necessity. They were fewer in number, more scattered, and quickly realized that without the local peoples, their chances of survival were minimal. This did not make them innocent. They participated in wars, manipulated tribal disputes, and established their own network of domination, softer in appearance, but just as invasive. The English, for their part, arrived later, but with a different strategy: mass colonization. Not only soldiers or missionaries came, but entire families, expelled Puritans, ambitious merchants, and social outcasts in search of a second chance. They founded Jamestown in the year 1607, Plymouth in the year 1620, and continued spreading along the Atlantic coast. There began the pattern that would define the territory's future: take land, displace natives, build self-sufficient settlements, and reproduce the values of a Europe that, paradoxically, many of these colonists had fled. For indigenous peoples, the arrival of the English was a new and deeper challenge. It was not just a matter of fighting or negotiating. It was a sustained, constant displacement, a tide that would not retreat. Treaties were signed and broken. Gifts were exchanged in diplomatic ceremonies that hid traps. Relations between natives and Europeans varied depending on the time, region, and interest. There were real alliances, mixed marriages, and fierce armed resistance. But one truth became clearer with time: Europe was not leaving. What had started as a series of scattered missions became a global conflict for control of the continent. By the year 1650, the eastern part of North America was a minefield of tensions between European empires. The colonies competed with one another, spied on each other, sabotaged each other. International diplomacy also played out in the forests of Virginia and the icy waters of Nova Scotia. European rivalries were transplanted to the American continent and dragged indigenous nations into the fray, forcing them to choose foreign allies against immediate enemies. Meanwhile, the rules of the colonial game were evolving. Indigenous labor was soon replaced by a new source of power: African slaves. The first plantations in Virginia and Carolina began to flourish at the cost of human suffering. The continent, already wounded by epidemics and wars, became the perfect stage for a new kind of economy, one based on limitless extraction, systematic exploitation, and the triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa, and America as parts of an infernal machine. And yet, in the midst of that chaos, within the brutality of that process that many still called discovery, the first signs of what was to come began to emerge. The colonies, although dependent on their crowns, began to build their own identities. Their inhabitants developed a new way of seeing themselves. They were no longer simply English, French, or Spanish in foreign lands. They were something different, shaped by the climate, the environment, the constant conflict, and the feeling of starting anew. It was a seed, barely perceptible, but alive. The version of history we are usually taught presents this period as a prologue, a mere introduction to the real story. But in truth, this was a transformation of such magnitude that the world, quite literally, was never the same again. It was the moment when the continent's clock changed rhythm, when ancient names began to disappear, and a different story began to assert itself with relentless force. And as ships continued to arrive, as flags multiplied on each newly conquered shore, a new threat began to appear. It was not a storm coming from afar. It was an internal change, something being born within those first colonies, in their tensions, in their contradictions, in their dreams of freedom that would soon collide with the very chains they had brought with them. Because the conflict had already been planted, and it would not be long before European blood itself began to boil within the very borders they had drawn. The struggle to survive on the frontier. The first settlers did not step into a paradise. They stepped into a foreign, harsh, and often deadly world. History tends to romanticize those foundational years as if they were golden pages filled with bravery and hope. But in reality, what they experienced was a constant mix of fear, hunger, uncertainty, and mistakes. They arrived in search of freedom, wealth, or redemption. What they found was mud, fever, and hostility. And still, against all logic, they stayed. They persevered. Because behind every inch conquered, behind every campfire burning in the middle of the forest, there was an almost blind conviction that everything could begin again. When the English founded Jamestown in the year 1607, they had no clear guide as to what awaited them. They had heard tales of gold, of fertile lands, of abundance. What they did not expect was malaria, hunger, mosquitoes, and a completely untamable environment. The colony, which began with more than 100 men, came close to disappearing several times. During the so-called starving time, the survivors ate leather, rats, and even, according to documents from the time, human corpses. Many died, others deserted, but a few, out of stubbornness, faith, or perhaps desperation, endured. And with them, the first nucleus of the future English presence in North America survived. Unlike the Spanish settlements farther south, which were driven by crowns, clergy, and armies, the English colonies on the Atlantic coast were born under a more ambiguous logic. Jamestown was a business venture, a gamble funded by a private company, the Virginia Company. And that changes everything. Because from the beginning, the logic was economic. It was not so much about founding a new world as it was about extracting wealth from the old one. And in that pursuit, morality could wait. Alliances with indigenous peoples, such as the Powhatan, were fragile, practical, subject to interests that could collapse at the slightest misunderstanding. And misunderstandings came quickly. Over time, The need to grow profitable crops pushed the settlers inland, invading lands sacred to native peoples. Tobacco became Jamestown's great salvation, but also its moral downfall. To grow enough tobacco, land was needed, and that land had owners. And although the settlers denied it, every acre they occupied was a declaration of war. Endless cycles of truces and massacres followed. Diplomatic gifts were answered with bloody ambushes, promises were broken, and revenge escalated. The frontier was a constant tension zone, where survival was not a right, but a privilege earned at the expense of others. Meanwhile, in the north, another experiment was taking shape. In the year 1620, a group of religious separatists who called themselves the Pilgrims arrived on the shores of what is now Massachusetts aboard the Mayflower. Unlike the colonists in Virginia, these were not chasing gold, but spiritual purity. They had been persecuted in England, rejected in the Netherlands, and were seeking to establish a society where they could practice their faith without external interference. But what they found was not the promised land, but a brutal winter, total scarcity, and hostile terrain. Nearly half of them died during the first few months. It was the indigenous peoples, particularly the Wampanoag, who helped them survive that first year. They taught them how to plant corn, use fish as fertilizer, and understand an ecosystem that, for them, was a mystery. The initial relationship was relatively peaceful. Treaties were signed, harvests were celebrated, meals were shared. The myth of Thanksgiving was born from that moment, although what followed was anything but gratitude. Over the years, more settlers began to arrive, more land was occupied, more tensions arose, and the Puritan logic, which at first upheld religious brotherhood, became exclusionary, rigid, and obsessive. Anyone who thought differently was an enemy. Every difference was suspicious. The utopia hardened until it became a theocracy with no room for dissent. From these tensions emerged figures who challenged the established order. Roger Williams, for example, was expelled from Massachusetts for defending freedom of conscience and the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands. He founded the colony of Rhode Island, based on religious tolerance and the separation between church and state, an idea that, centuries later, would become a pillar of the United States Constitution. Anne Hutchinson was persecuted for preaching different religious interpretations, and her punishment revealed the fragility of the promise of freedom among those who claimed to have come in search of it. At the same time, other colonies were forming with different motivations. Maryland was founded as a refuge for Catholics. Pennsylvania, conceived by William Penn, was a Quaker utopia that promoted peace, equity, and understanding with native peoples. In the South, Carolina and Georgia began to develop as plantation territories, with a growing dependence on forced labor. And in all these places, despite their differences, a pattern began to take shape. Land was wealth, and that wealth had to be defended with borders, laws, and force. Throughout the first half of the 17th century, colonial life was a constant mix of tension, slow growth, and forced adaptation. Diseases continued to claim victims. Winters were relentless. Trade routes were rudimentary, and the isolation between colonies created very distinct regional identities. While New England was organized around churches and compact towns, the South fragmented into large rural estates with social structures marked by inequality. And at the center of it all, an unresolved contradiction. The settlers who spoke of freedom and autonomy were, at the same time, building their world on the labor of the weakest. First, indigenous people were captured and forced to serve. Then, Africans were brought by force, chained, sold like animals, turned into the involuntary pillars of colonial progress. The seed of slavery, which would become the greatest moral and political dilemma of the future republic, was already beginning to take deep root. Daily life on the frontier was hard and dangerous. There were surprise attacks, fires, thefts, and public punishments. But there were also moments of community, learning, and invention. Wooden houses were built, assemblies were organized, pamphlets were printed, laws were debated. The idea that local matters could be resolved without the direct intervention of the crown began to gain strength. The settlers started thinking for themselves, negotiating with their environment, defending their own interests. And although they still considered themselves loyal subjects of the king, the geographical and mental distance between America and London was growing ever larger. Thus, step by step, amid mud, blood, and sermons, something deeper than a colony was being forged. A mindset. The frontier mindset. The idea that the world was a space to conquer, transform, and defend. A vision where danger was constant, but so was the possibility of starting anew. That spirit, contradictory and fierce, would become the fuel for future generations. And as the colonies took root, a new force began to grow. Still invisible, but present. A force that, with time, would begin to look with suspicion at kings, viceroys, and the distances imposed from Europe. Because there is no settlement that does not awaken ambition, and where there is ambition, sooner or later, there is conflict. The ground had been sown, and the spark was already approaching. Slavery as a foundation. Sometimes history is written with beautiful words: freedom, independence, progress. But beneath those concepts, like dark and buried foundations, there are structures not spoken of with as much pride. Slavery was one of them. It was not a momentary mistake or an exception on the path toward a free nation. It was a systematic, profitable decision, justified with speeches that claimed to be rational, when in reality they were merely excuses to justify the unjustifiable. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is that without it, without that imposed suffering, without that economy of the whip and the chain, the English colonial project would never have survived. And what is now known as the United States might not exist as we know it. The arrival of enslaved Africans to the English colonies was not an isolated event, nor an accidental consequence of Atlantic trade. It was a planned, sustained, and progressive operation that began in earnest in the year 1619, when a Dutch ship disembarked in Virginia with 20 captured Africans. From then on, slavery became increasingly central to the colonial economy, especially in the South, where the climate and soil favored crops that required intensive labor: tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton. These plantations could not be sustained by small landowners or wage laborers. They needed bodies subjected without rest, without pay, without rights. And slavery provided that, and more. It offered inheritance, forced reproduction, and human property passed down from generation to generation. The slave trade was one of the most profitable industries in the world for several centuries. From the coasts of West Africa, millions of men, women, and children were captured, sold, branded like livestock, and shipped under inhumane conditions. The so-called Middle Passage was a journey of weeks or months, where heat, disease, and despair turned the ship holds into floating cemeteries. It is estimated that between 15 and 20% of the captives died before reaching the Americas. And those who survived did so with broken spirits and a destiny imposed by the brutal logic of economic profit. Upon arrival, their names were erased. Their languages were forbidden. Their beliefs were ridiculed or deemed demonic. What followed was a daily routine of exhausting labor, exemplary punishments, constant surveillance, and violence that required no justification. Because punishment was not just correction, it was spectacle. The body had to be disciplined, but also the soul. And for that there were whips, shackles, public mutilations, iron collars, ritual humiliations. Everything was designed to destroy the will, to crush the possibility of inner escape. And yet, in the midst of that machinery of oppression, there was something that could not be completely destroyed: resistance. Sometimes it was visible and direct, like organized escapes or uprisings. At other times, it was silent, singing in code, breaking tools, pretending to be ill, secretly teaching reading, preserving ancient rituals far from the master's gaze. Every small act of autonomy was a form of resistance. And although official histories have tried to minimize that resistance, the truth is that there was never slavery without rebellion, without intelligence for survival, without creativity to remain human in a world that sought to deny them that very condition. During the first decades of the 17th century, slavery coexisted with other labor systems, such as indentured servitude. Many poor Europeans arrived in the colonies as servants who had to work for several years to pay off their passage. But after that time, they were freed. They could acquire land, start families, build their own lives. Enslaved Africans, on the other hand, had no horizon. Their condition was perpetual, and over time laws made it clear. Skin color defined destiny. To be black was to be property. And if you were born to an enslaved woman, you were enslaved too, without exception. Legal codes began to institutionalize this reality. In Virginia, in the year 1662, it was decreed that a child's status would follow that of the mother. Later, interracial marriages were prohibited. Punishments were set according to the ethnic origin of the accused, and mechanisms multiplied to justify slavery as a natural order. From the pulpits, some preachers claimed that slavery was permitted by the scriptures. From the universities, certain thinkers argued that Africans were naturally inferior. It was a practical consensus, morally corrupt, but useful for those who benefited from the system. Slavery did not only enrich plantation owners, it shaped the entire colonial economy. Slave ships were financed by English banks. Insurance companies protected human cargo as if it were any other merchandise. Northern merchants built fortunes selling products that supplied the southern estates. Elite universities received donations from slaveholding families. Churches, in many cases, blessed the masters and demanded obedience from the enslaved. It was a network so deep that it crossed religion, politics, science, commerce, and culture. In the North, although slavery existed on a smaller scale, it was not absent. Cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had enslaved populations. And although over time some of these colonies began to debate its legality. For much of the colonial period, slavery was seen as just another part of the social landscape. Some criticized it, yes, but their voices were isolated. Those who defended the rights of indigenous peoples sometimes remained silent about African suffering. Contradictions were everywhere, but they were rarely acknowledged. And despite that bleak landscape, Afro-descendant culture flourished in unexpected ways. In spiritual songs, lament mixed with secret codes. In Afro-Christian worship, ancestral traditions survived disguised as evangelism. In kitchens, languages, stories, and worldviews, the people brought from Africa left a profound mark that forever transformed American identity, even though that influence was silenced for centuries. The founding myth of freedom, so present in the speeches of the English colonies, became from the beginning an unbearable paradox. Because while the colonists spoke of resisting tyranny, they ruled like small monarchs over bodies that were not free. While printing pamphlets about natural rights, their own laws denied those rights to millions. The contradiction was not marginal, it was structural. And it was that contradiction that, over time, would become an open wound. A wound that would cross entire generations, divide families, states, and eventually, the entire country. But in those early centuries, that wound was covered. It was part of the order. Slavery was not discussed as a crime, but as a necessity. It was the norm. As the colonies expanded and the economy grew, the slave system grew stronger. And behind the growth, behind the trade, the tobacco, the sugar, the great names that now adorn universities and streets, were millions of people deprived of everything, except their dignity. A dignity that no one could fully strip away, no matter how hard they tried. Because no matter how many chains they placed, no matter how many laws they passed, No matter how many churches blessed the injustice, there were always those who dreamed of freedom, even when they did not yet know how to pronounce that word in English. And those dreams, though buried for centuries, would eventually rise. The system endured, but it trembled. And those who lived at the top did not yet know it. But in the shadows of their own plantations, the first echoes of an inevitable explosion were already being heard, one that would not take long to arrive. A global war that changed America. Sometimes wars that seem distant end up shaping the lives of those who never held a weapon. During the 18th century, while the English colonies in North America continued to grow, struggling to stay alive amid unpredictable harvests, indigenous tensions, and an economy sustained by slavery, the fate of the continent was decided, in part, by a war born far from its fields. A war that began as an imperial dispute between European powers, but that ended up dragging America into a conflict on a global scale. The 7 Years' War did not only change borders, it changed the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, and it planted the seed of a future, much deeper conflict. Officially, it began in the year 1756. But in North America, fighting had already started 2 years earlier. Clashes between British and French settlers over control of the Ohio River Valley marked the boiling point of tensions that had been building for decades. Both empires had grown strongly on the continent, and their zones of influence were beginning to collide. While the French expanded westward, establishing forts and alliances with key indigenous peoples, the British pushed out from the 13 colonies, with their eyes on fertile lands and trade routes they were not willing to give up. The conflict became inevitable, and as in almost all colonial wars, those who paid the highest price were not the great powers, but the indigenous peoples caught in the middle. The tribes had to choose whom to ally with, knowing that picking the wrong side could mean extermination. Some, like the Hurons and the Algonquins, aligned with the French, who until then had maintained a more diplomatic and less aggressive approach toward native lands. Others, like the Iroquois, saw in the British an opportunity to stop their ancestral enemies and gain commercial advantages. But none of those alliances guaranteed safety. European logic did not understand borders as flexible agreements, but as lines carved in stone. The conflict in America was only one front of a war that extended to Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, India, and the oceans. It was, in many ways, the first truly global war. And although for British colonists in America, it seemed like a struggle to defend themselves from the French enemy, in reality, they were being used as part of a broader imperial strategy, where their interests were relegated to the background. One of the most remembered figures from this period was a young officer from Virginia named George Washington. At the age of 22, he led an expedition westward to claim disputed territories. His incursion, poorly planned and even more poorly executed, provoked an ambush that lit the fuse of the conflict. The image of Washington, who would later become a symbol of independence, began to take shape amid mistakes and tensions that illustrated how fragile the line was between personal ambition and geopolitics. In the following years, battles raged intensely. Cities changed hands, forts were destroyed, and thousands died in dense forests where mud, rain, and fire created a tactical hell. But despite the hardships, the British demographic superiority in America, with a much larger population than the French, and the naval support from London tipped the balance. In the year 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the French lost almost all their possessions in North America. Canada came under British control, and France withdrew from the colonial game in the region, retaining only a few Caribbean islands. For the British Empire, the victory was costly, very costly. The Crown's finances were deeply affected. The cost of mobilizing troops, arming armies, and maintaining war operations was such that the public debt reached alarming levels. And that bill could not be paid from London. Someone had to cover the expenses. And that someone was the colonies. King George III and his government, convinced they had protected their American subjects, considered it logical that those same colonists should contribute financially. After all, the war, from their point of view, had been fought to defend them. What they failed to understand was that the colonies did not share that vision. For many colonists, the war had been just another extension of imperial competition, and although they valued the security gained, they did not gladly accept being treated as pawns in a chess game they did not control. Thus began a new phase, one of disillusionment, of suspicion, of us against them, even if that them was officially their own homeland. The British Parliament imposed a series of fiscal measures aimed at recovering the money invested in the war. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Acts sought to increase revenue through direct taxes on the colonies. These were laws that the colonists had not approved, nor discussed, nor voted on, and that awakened a dangerous feeling, the sense of injustice. Until then, British colonists in America had felt part of the empire. They were proud subjects, loyal to the king, heirs to a legal tradition that revered individual rights. But the new measures shattered that illusion. If they could be taxed without representation, what would stop them from being stripped of their land or their freedom tomorrow? The old promise of equality within the empire was beginning to crack, and with it a question was born that could no longer be ignored. What are we, really? As the British government hardened its stance, sending more troops and reinforcing control, pamphlets multiplied in the colonies, along with fiery speeches and clandestine assemblies. Local leaders emerged who understood the power of words and the importance of organization. Political discourse became charged with emotion, with symbols, with appeals to ancient history, to Rome, to Sparta, to republican virtue, but also to pragmatism. If the colonists produced the wealth, why could they not control it? That military conflict between empires had ended in victory for Great Britain. But that victory brought with it a new conflict, more complex, more intimate. The war that had been fought in the forests of Pennsylvania and the lakes of Canada had been bloody. But the war beginning in the streets of Boston, in the coffee houses of Philadelphia, in the fields of Virginia, was a war of ideas. And once ideas are ignited, they are difficult to extinguish. The colonists were no longer confident subjects. Now they were voiceless taxpayers, watched by troops, questioned for their loyalty, pushed to obey decisions made across the ocean. The frontier was no longer just geographical. It was also emotional, mental, political. Something had broken. And although the word independence had yet to be heard, its echo was beginning to slip into everyday conversations. Every great conflict leaves behind visible rubble and invisible fractures. The 7 Years' War redrew the map of the continent. But more importantly, it redrew the mental map of the colonists. They no longer thought as they once had. They had learned that they could fight, that they could organize, that they could face imperial power and survive. And that lesson was not going to disappear with treaties or promises. A profound change was underway, and the next chapter of the story would be much harder to control. The rebellion of the colonists. The fire did not start with a cannon. There was no majestic declaration, nor a banner waving in the wind. It all began with taxes, with stamped sheets of paper, laws dictated in a distant city, foreign voices speaking of order when no one in the colonies had asked them to impose any order. After the war against the French, the British government believed it was only fair that its colonists in America pay part of the debt left by the victory. London believed it had saved its subjects from the French enemy. But in the streets of Boston, in the taverns of Philadelphia, in the fields of Virginia, the feeling was very different. They felt the crown was beginning to treat them like vassals, not like citizens. The first shock came with the Stamp Act in the year 1765. A seemingly simple regulation, it required that many documents, from licenses to newspapers, carry an official stamp that confirmed the payment of a tax. It was not the amount that angered the people, but the principle. For the first time, a direct tax was being imposed from London, without the colonists having any say in the decision. The motto went viral long before social media existed: no taxation without representation. They were not questioning the authority of the king. They were demanding that such authority be exercised with justice. What followed was a wave of protests, organized boycotts, the burning of stamps, spontaneous marches, and increasingly incendiary speeches. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty were founded, beginning to coordinate acts of disobedience. Merchants refused to import British goods. Local assemblies sent formal letters to Parliament. And meanwhile, in the streets, outrage was growing. What had once been a murmur was now an outcry. The British government withdrew the law, but did not abandon its idea of control. New measures arrived. The Townshend Acts, which taxed basic goods such as tea, glass, and paper. To the colonists, it was a direct provocation, and in response they intensified the boycott, while the British military presence in the cities increased. In Boston, the soldiers were seen as occupiers. They walked armed through the streets, slept in requisitioned houses, and maintained order with barely contained tension. The atmosphere was flammable. It only needed a spark. That spark came on a freezing March afternoon in the year 1770. A group of citizens confronted British soldiers verbally. Insults were exchanged, then stones, snowballs with debris. The soldiers, cornered, opened fire. 5 people died. The scene was etched into the collective memory as the Boston Massacre. From that moment on, the perception of the enemy changed. It was no longer abstract. It was no longer a distant parliament. It had a face, a uniform, a rifle, and it was present in the streets. Despite the horror, most colonists were not yet calling for independence. They wanted reforms, respect, representation. But from London, the response was harshness. Punitive laws were passed, known as the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed. Rights to self-government were suspended. British soldiers were granted the right to be tried in England for crimes committed in the colonies. The intent was to punish. But what they achieved was to unify the colonies, which until then had acted in a scattered way. In September of the year 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Delegates from almost all the colonies debated for weeks. There was no talk of breaking away, but there was talk of resistance. Measures were proposed to pressure the crown. Formal petitions were written to the king. A commercial boycott was organized, and in secret, some began preparing local militias. The stage was set, and soon the conflict would cease to be political and become armed. At dawn on the 19th of April in the year 1775, on the dusty roads between Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, it all began. British troops left Boston with orders to seize weapons stored by the colonists and to arrest rebel leaders. But someone gave the warning. The militiamen, known as Minutemen, were ready. No one knows who fired first, but that shot became a symbol. It was the shot heard around the world, the formal beginning of a war that, in its early stages, seemed absurdly unbalanced. The British were an empire. They had the best-trained army, the most powerful navy, the resources of a superpower. The colonies were, in comparison, a scattered group of farmers, merchants, lawyers, printers, and craftsmen, without experience, without a centralized structure, without enough weapons. But they had something the empire could not buy: conviction. As the year 1775 advanced, the conflict intensified. The battles of Bunker Hill, of Ticonderoga, of Montreal showed that the colonists were capable of standing their ground. An unexpected figure emerged: George Washington, chosen as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. With military experience, natural leadership, and a long-term vision, he began to organize a force that, although improvised, gradually gained cohesion. In parallel, ideas were also evolving. It was no longer enough to demand representation. More and more voices were openly speaking of independence. Pamphlets like Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, circulated through the colonies with overwhelming force. In accessible, direct, and passionate language, Paine argued that it made no sense for an island to rule a continent, that monarchy was an unnatural institution, and that the time had come to break ties. It was more than a text. It was a call to action. Finally, on the 4th of July in the year 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson and signed by representatives of the 13 colonies, it proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they have inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document was not only a formal break with Great Britain, it was a philosophical declaration of what a just nation should be. And although in practice many of those words would not be fulfilled, and some of its signers were slave owners, the declaration became a symbol of struggle for future generations around the world. From then on, the war changed in nature. It was no longer about resistance. It was a conflict for the survival of a new nation. The colonists went from being rebellious subjects to citizens at war for their right to exist. The British Empire responded with more troops, with German mercenaries, with blockades. But the insurgents had a vast territory, local support networks, knowledge of the land, and above all, a motivation that went beyond military strategy. The war would last for years. It would stretch across mountains, coasts, cities, and fields, and it would leave deep scars. But what had begun as a protest over taxes had become a full-scale revolution, a revolution that would shake the structures of imperial power, that would lead to debates about sovereignty, rights, and citizenship, and that would set in motion a force difficult to contain, the idea that a people can govern itself. Everything that had been latent, the accumulated tension, colonial ambition, the inequality between metropolis and periphery, exploded at the right moment. And what emerged from those ashes was something unexpected. A nascent nation, still uncertain, still in dispute, but alive. And while the sound of cannons began to mark the rhythm of a new era, deeper dilemmas remained to be resolved. Because declaring freedom was one thing, building it, defending it, and sustaining it was something very different. The birth of an unstable republic. The war for independence had ended, but the most difficult battle was just beginning. Because taking power away from a king is one thing, learning to govern oneself without becoming another tyrant is something very different. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris in the year 1783, Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the 13 colonies, and the world was astonished by an idea as radical as it was dangerous. A group of provinces with no king, no hereditary nobility, and no official church claimed it could be free and self-sufficient. But between hope and chaos lies a thin line, and the United States walked that line for years, staggering, stumbling, learning the hard way what it means to be a republic. In theory, the country had been born. In practice, it was a network of states with different histories, economies, and visions, barely tied together by a voluntary alliance held on paper. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war, functioned as a kind of contract between equals, but they were weak, vague, and incapable of solving the major problems ahead. Congress had no power to collect taxes, could not impose laws or maintain a permanent army, and each state acted as if it were a sovereign nation. The idea of a union was more symbolic than real. The scenario that emerged was unsettling. The army was in debt, the soldiers had not been paid, foreign loans demanded repayment, merchants were facing collapse, the circulating currencies were worth less each day, and internal uprisings began to multiply. What should have been a time of construction became an era of uncertainty. In Massachusetts, in the year 1786, a group of veterans led by Daniel Shays rose in arms against the state government. They demanded relief from unpayable debts and abusive taxes. Many of them had fought in the Revolution believing in freedom, and now they saw their lands confiscated by unyielding courts. The rebellion was suppressed, but it left behind a disturbing message. The new country could collapse from within. The ruling class understood that institutional fragility was not a minor issue, but an existential threat. And so, in the summer of the year 1787 in Philadelphia, a convention was called, theoretically to reform the Articles of Confederation. In practice, what happened was something far more ambitious. Behind closed doors, with no press or public records, delegates from different states met to design a new system of government from scratch. What happened there was a clash of interests, fears, ideals, and cold calculations. And from that conflict emerged a political creature that would shape the centuries to come. The result was the Constitution of the United States. A brief, precise document, but with enormous implications. It created a strong federal government with defined powers, a clear separation between the three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, and an architecture designed to balance human ambition with legal limits. The idea was to avoid tyranny without falling into anarchy, to create a system that, although imperfect, could sustain itself even if its leaders were not up to the task. It was, in a way, an act of lucid distrust. Trust was not placed in men, but in the design. But that design was far from neutral. Every word was debated, every clause negotiated. The southern states, deeply dependent on slavery, demanded guarantees to preserve their particular institutions. The compromise was disturbing. Enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for political representation purposes. They could not vote. They were not citizens, but they contributed to the political power of those who owned them. It was a cynical, mathematical calculation that revealed how far the proclaimed freedom had concrete limits. The role of the president was also debated, the method of election, the balance between large and small states. The disagreements were so deep that more than once the convention was on the brink of collapse. But fear of failure, the threat of an early civil war or a foreign invasion, kept the delegates at the table. The final result was ideal for no one, but acceptable to all. And thus, the new system was sent to the states for ratification. The public reaction was immediate and polarized. Two factions emerged: the Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who feared it. The former, led by figures such as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of essays later known as the Federalist Papers, in which they defended the logic and necessity of the new system. They argued that an extensive republic with diverse interests could avoid despotism if it was properly structured. That freedom needed a framework, that without law there is no order, and without order there is no justice. The Anti-Federalists, for their part, warned that the new government concentrated too much power, that without a clear list of rights, the people were left defenseless against possible abuses. That history was full of republics that had become corrupted, and they had reasons to distrust. They had just fought a war against a king. They did not want to create a more elegant substitute. The debate was intense, and to calm fears, the Federalists promised to add a set of amendments that would guarantee fundamental rights. Thus was born the Bill of Rights, approved in the year 1791, which included the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. There were enshrined principles that today are considered essential: freedom of speech, of the press, of religion, the right to bear arms, protection against arbitrary searches, the right to a fair trial. Each of those rights was born from conflict, from the living memory of what it means to live under oppressive power. In the year 1789, with the Constitution in effect, the first federal elections were held. George Washington, by almost unanimous acclaim, became the first president. No one doubted his integrity or his patriotism. He had been the symbol of the struggle, the silent father of victory. But not even his figure could hide the cracks. Beneath the surface of the young republic, deep tensions stirred, economic, ideological, regional, and racial. The construction of a country was a monumental task, and no one had any guarantees that it would work. Washington, in his speeches and letters, warned about the dangers of partisanship, foreign alliances, and personal ambition. But those warnings were soon overshadowed by reality. Disagreements over the economic model, international relations, and the scope of federal power began to divide leaders into factions. The first political parties emerged. Hamilton's Federalists, who wanted a strong government and an industrialized economy, and Jefferson's Republicans, defenders of agriculture, of states' rights, and of a more decentralized vision of power. From the very beginning, the Republic was both a promise and a paradox. It proclaimed equality, while millions lived in slavery. It spoke of freedom, but women could not vote. It was building a nation under the law, while indigenous peoples were displaced and treated as obstacles. Every achievement had a shadow. Every step forward carried a moral debt. And yet, the idea endured. The experiment remained alive. Because despite the contradictions, or perhaps because of them, the Constitution became a mirror in which the country could see itself. Not as a fixed photograph, but as a blank page, a contested canvas, a structure flexible enough to adapt, yet firm enough to avoid collapse. The revolution had ended, but the construction of the nation was only just beginning. And what would come in the following decades would test, again and again, whether that building of words could sustain the complexity of a land full of dissonant voices, conflicting interests, and opposing dreams. Because written freedom is not enough. It must be lived. And that, in America, was never easy. The dream of the West comes at a price. From the moment the new country stood shakily on its feet, one idea pulled it forward with unstoppable force. That beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers not yet drawn on maps, beyond the horizon the sun abandoned each night, there was a destiny to be fulfilled. A destiny that was not individual, not even collective, but almost sacred. Something inevitable. An expansion assumed as a right, as a mission, as an obligation. History would call it manifest destiny. But deep down, it was a divine-sounding excuse to justify a very human ambition: conquest. The young republic, barely established, began to look westward with hunger. The 13 coastal states were no longer enough. Land was synonymous with wealth, and the frontier became a symbolic space where the promise of freedom merged with the reality of dispossession. In the year 1803, the Great Leap took place. Under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, the United States purchased the vast territory of Louisiana from France, an immense expanse that doubled the size of the country. For $15 million, it acquired an unfinished map. No one knew exactly what it included, who lived there, or how it could possibly be governed. But that did not matter. The country had grown in one sweeping move. To explore these newly acquired lands, an expedition was organized that would become legendary. Lewis and Clark, with a group of 30 men, crossed forests, rivers, plains, and mountains, gathering data, mapping, and establishing contact with dozens of indigenous nations, many of whom had not yet had any direct contact with the American government. What Washington viewed as a scientific mission, the native peoples saw as a silent announcement. The new masters from the East were on their way. At first, the push westward was an adventure. Entire families launched themselves into the conquest of virgin lands with wagons, rifles, and Bibles. Makeshift settlements were built. Newly cleared fields were cultivated with axes, and towns were founded with names borrowed from the Bible, from European memories, or from indigenous languages that would gradually be erased. But that romantic adventure stood on a simple logic. Someone had to give up the land, and that someone did not do so willingly. Federal policy ensured that such giving up became systematic. Through treaties, pressure, fraud, and war, the government began stripping tribes of their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act, signed by Andrew Jackson in the year 1830, legalized one of the most brutal policies in United States history: the forced relocation of entire peoples to regions in the West, supposedly reserved for them. The most remembered and most tragic case was that of the Cherokees, forced to abandon their lands in Georgia and march to what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way, in what became known as the Trail of Tears. And that was only one of many displacements. As the frontier advanced, so did the reach of federal power. New territories were created, states were founded, and boundaries were drawn with rulers, without consulting anyone living there. The telegraph, the railroad, and the rifle were the three tools driving this transformation. The first connected words, the second transported goods, and the third imposed silence. Every mile conquered was a fulfilled promise for the settlers, but an open wound for those who had lived on those lands since times no one in Washington cared to understand. Expansion was not only geographic, it was ideological. The country saw itself as a project in constant growth, a civilizing force destined to occupy the entire continent. That idea became an unwritten law. When Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico in the year 1836, requested annexation, Congress barely debated. In the year 1845, Texas became part of the United States, triggering direct conflict with Mexico. What followed was a short but decisive war, the Mexican-American War, between the years 1846 and 1848, was portrayed as an inevitable crusade, though many within the country questioned it as a war of conquest disguised as defense. American troops advanced swiftly, seizing territory after territory, and eventually entered Mexico City. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in the year 1848, Mexico ceded more than half of its territory, what today includes California, Nevada, Utah, much of Arizona, New Mexico, and others. It was the dream of expansion made real, but it came with a question that would haunt the nation for decades to come. What should be done with those new territories? Would they be free states or slave states? Slavery, which already divided North and South, now infected every decision, every territorial incorporation, every legislative debate. Each inch gained in the West reopened a wound that had never fully healed. And the more the country grew, the more evident it became that the original pact, the one that had held the Republic together since its founding, was beginning to crack. Despite these tensions, the mystical vision of the West remained alive. The gold rush in California in the year 1849 attracted thousands of adventurers, opportunists, dreamers, and fugitives. In just a few months, improvised settlements transformed into cities, and violence reigned in those lawless spaces where wealth could be found underground and lost by nightfall. It was the American dream in its rawest form: absolute individualism, fierce competition, and the chance to change your fate with a shovel and a bit of luck. Indigenous peoples, caught between broken treaties, false promises, and relentless expansion, watched their world unravel before their eyes. Some tried to adapt, adopting farming practices, forming their own governments, and signing coexistence agreements. Others resisted with weapons, led by figures who today symbolize dignity and struggle, like Tecumseh, Geronimo, or Sitting Bull. But resistance had its limits. The weight of the state, militias, armed settlers, and a public increasingly hostile toward the so-called savages always tipped the scales the same way. And yet that structural violence remained invisible to many. Popular culture, the press, frontier novels, and even political decisions presented expansion as a moral epic, a crusade for freedom, progress, and civilization. They spoke of barbarians who needed saving, of lands waiting to be used, of a bright future that justified any price. That is how myths are built, with convenient lies and useful silences. The frontier, as a concept, defined American identity for decades. It represented infinite possibility, constant change, the promise of a new life. But it also left a trail of blood, displacements, wars, and appropriation. It was, at once, symbol and wound. And while the country celebrated its growth, the foundations holding it up were filled with contradictions too great to ignore. Because at some point, every frontier reaches a limit. And when there is no more land left to conquer, what emerges is the inevitable question: who are we really? A people united by principles, or a nation built on the expulsion of others? At that crossroads, history began to signal a fracture far deeper than any geographic boundary, one that would divide hearts, families, territories, and dreams. A division that was about to explode. The country splits in two. For years, the United States moved forward as if it could leave its wounds behind. Westward expansion, economic growth, and the promise of a glorious national destiny gave the appearance of steady progress. But beneath that surface, tensions were building, like pressure deep inside a mountain. And when pressure has no outlet, it explodes. That is what happened with the Civil War. It was not just a conflict between two regions. It was the collapse of a nation trying to move forward with a divided soul, as if it were possible to sustain a democracy on the shoulders of slavery. In the end, the country did not explode because it was weak. It exploded because it was too strong in its contradictions. The confrontation between the North and the South had been building for decades. They were different worlds, with opposing economies, incompatible social models, and visions of the country that could not coexist without eventually colliding. In the South, the economy revolved around plantations, cotton, and a deeply rooted system of slavery, not only as an economic practice, but as a cultural pillar. The North, on the other hand, was advancing toward industrialization, with growing urban centers, emerging new social classes, an ethic of wage labor, and an increasingly marked, though not uniform, rejection of the slave system. But it was not morality that ignited the war, at least not directly. It was politics. Every new state added to the country brought with it an unavoidable decision. Would it allow slavery or not? The answer to that question affected not only the inhabitants of the new territory, but also shifted the balance of power in Congress. If slave states prevailed, the South would retain political control. If free states grew in number, the North could block Southern decisions. It was a battle without gunpowder, but just as dangerous. Attempts to resolve this conflict through partial compromises failed one after another. The Missouri Compromise of the year 1820, the Compromise of the year 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All were fragile agreements that postponed the problem without confronting it directly. Every time the country seemed to find balance, something destabilized it. And with each new crisis, mistrust between the two regions grew deeper, more bitter, and more irreparable. One of the hardest blows to that fragile balance came in the year 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. It allowed the residents of those territories to vote on whether or not to permit slavery. It seemed like a democratic gesture, but it opened the door to chaos. Pro-slavery settlers and abolitionists flooded the region, trying to influence the results by force. There were murders, looting, and arson. The area became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it proved that violence was no longer a distant threat. It was present. it had come to stay. In that charged atmosphere, voices emerged that further polarized the situation. Among them, one would become decisive: Abraham Lincoln. Austere in appearance and sober in speech, Lincoln was not born a radical abolitionist, but his position evolved over time. He did not seek to eliminate slavery overnight, but he did want to stop its expansion. That stance, for the South, was unacceptable. It meant placing limits on their way of life, their economy, their vision of the country. And when Lincoln won the election of the year 1860 without a single electoral vote from the South, the leaders of that region interpreted it as a declaration of war. The first state to secede was South Carolina in December of the year 1860. Then came Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In just a few weeks, 7 states had declared their departure from the Union. They formed their own government, wrote a constitution, and elected a president, Jefferson Davis. Thus, the Confederate States of America were born. The rupture was official, though no blood had yet been shed. The final spark came in April of the year 1861, when Confederate troops attacked Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold in South Carolina. It was a symbolic act more than a major battle, but it marked the point of no return. Lincoln responded with a call to arms. The war had begun, and what followed was the bloodiest conflict in the history of the United States. The Civil War was not a series of grand epic battles, as it is sometimes portrayed. It was a long, dirty, brutal war, marked by disorganization, civilian suffering, hunger, the destruction of entire cities, and domestic violence that tore apart communities, families, and entire regions. More than 600,000 people died, many from disease, others from the inhuman conditions on the front lines. And while the cannons roared, the very idea of the nation wavered. The South had brilliant generals, such as Robert Edward Lee, a strategist respected even by his enemies. It had the defensive advantage, fighting on its own land, familiar with the terrain, and with a clear cause, at least from its own perspective. The North, by contrast, had more resources, more soldiers, and more industry. But at first, it lacked direction. Lincoln changed commanders several times until he found in Ulysses Simpson Grant a leader who understood that the war would not be won through individual battles, but through attrition. And that attrition required an unrelenting tactic: to crush the enemy, no matter the cost. Amid the conflict, Lincoln made a move that would forever change the meaning of the war. In January of the year 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the rebellious territories. It was a political act, but also a symbolic one. It turned the war into a moral crusade. It was no longer just about preserving the Union, but about redefining it, about cleansing it of the original sin it had carried since its founding. The war continued for 2 more years. There were decisive moments, such as the Battle of Gettysburg, which stopped the Confederate advance into the North, or General Sherman's march to the sea, a campaign of systematic destruction that left the heart of the South in ruins. Finally, in April of the year 1865, after the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital, Robert Edward Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. A few days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a Washington theater. A gunshot to the head ended the life of the man who had led the country through its worst crisis. And with his death, a new and equally turbulent chapter began. How to rebuild a nation that had just devoured itself. Because winning the war was only part of the problem. The other was how to heal. How to reintegrate the rebellious states. How to guarantee newly won freedom for millions of people. How to prevent history from repeating itself. The wounds were still open, and many wanted revenge. Others called for reconciliation, but no one had clear answers. And in that uncertainty, new shadows began to emerge. Because the end of the war was not the end of the conflict. It was only a brief pause in a story that still had unsettled accounts. Reconstruction and revenge in the South. When the Civil War ended, there was no true celebration. There were no joyful crowds in the streets, no triumphant parades with anthems shining among confetti. What remained was silence, smoke, hastily buried bodies, and a country torn to pieces, not only in its geography, but in its soul. Legal slavery had been abolished, the Confederacy defeated, and the Union preserved. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. How does one rebuild a nation that has destroyed itself from within? And even more important, how does one repair a centuries-old crime without provoking a new explosion? Reconstruction, that tense, brief, and poorly understood period that stretched from the year 1865 to approximately 1877, was, on the surface, a historic opportunity. The opportunity to remake the country on new foundations, to guarantee real rights to the newly freed, to democratize the South, to radically transform the political, social, and economic structure of the nation. But what seemed like an open door to the future ended up becoming a hall of broken mirrors, where every attempt to move forward stumbled over the shadow of the past that refused to die. With the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the country fell into the hands of his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern politician who, despite having remained loyal to the Union, had a very different vision of what should be done with the defeated South. Johnson promoted a policy of rapid reintegration, almost without conditions. Pardons for former Confederates, return of property, and immediate reintegration into the political process. For the white leaders of the South, this was a clear signal. They could return to power, as long as they accepted the formal end of slavery. And for the newly freed African Americans, it was a brutal betrayal. During the war, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people had escaped to Union Army lines. They had worked as porters, cooks, nurses, and even soldiers. They had risked everything for a promise of freedom. But that promise, once attained, became a new form of captivity. Freedom without land, without protection, without means, without real rights. Despite their new legal status, many were forced to work for their former masters under abusive contracts. Others wandered aimlessly, persecuted by laws designed to keep them under control. The so-called Black Codes, local laws imposed in the southern states, prohibited African Americans from voting, carrying weapons, meeting freely, or accessing education. Slavery had been abolished, but the system that upheld it remained alive. From Congress, the radical Republicans watched this backsliding with alarm. They were a group of legislators from the North who were not willing to let the sacrifices of the war be wasted in political compromises. They demanded firm measures, military oversight of the South, constitutional guarantees of equality, access to the vote for African American men, and punishment for Confederate leaders. In this context, 3 fundamental amendments emerged, marking the country's most ambitious attempt to redefine itself legally. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout United States territory. The 14th granted citizenship to all those born on United States soil, including former slaves, and promised equality under the law. And the 15th, perhaps the most controversial at the time, guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or color. On paper, the United States had been transformed. But in practice, those laws clashed with a reality poisoned by generations of white supremacy, by exclusionary economic structures, and by a violence that reinvented itself every time it was challenged. Because while equality was being discussed in the halls of the Capitol, in the southern fields, a new organization born of hatred was beginning to grow: the Ku Klux Klan. Founded by former Confederate soldiers, the Klan used terror as a form of resistance to change. Dressed in white, they rode horses at night, burned crosses, lynched, beat, raped, and murdered. Their goal was clear: that no one dared to challenge the old order. And for years, they operated with impunity, protected by the silence of entire communities that either shared their beliefs or simply feared confronting them. Despite that climate, for a brief time, there were surprising advances. Thanks to federal oversight and the efforts of organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau, African Americans voted en masse, gained access for the first time to formal education, founded independent churches, and some were even elected to public office: legislators, judges, sheriffs. It was a moment of dignity, of hope, of real reconstruction. But that bubble could not last. Not in a country where economic power remained in the same hands, where the cotton industry still dictated the rules, and where millions of poor white Southerners, who had never held real power, were manipulated into seeing the free African American as their enemy, not their equal. The presidential election of 1876 sealed the fate of Reconstruction. It was one of the most disputed and obscure elections in the country's history. The Republican candidate, Rutherford Burchard Hayes, did not have a guaranteed victory. To secure it, he made a deal with Southern Democrats. Federal troops would be withdrawn, and in exchange, they would recognize his presidency. The deal was sealed in darkness, without public consultation, and marked the beginning of the end. With the military withdrawal, the Southern states regained full control of their legislatures, and what became known as the Redemption Era began. But it was not redemption for everyone. It was revenge. New racial segregation laws were imposed, known as the Jim Crow laws. A system was built that, without the need for chains, kept oppression intact. Separate schools, separate bathrooms, separate churches, separate seating. And all of it reinforced by a judicial, police, and media apparatus that normalized inequality. Violence continued, but now it was institutionalized. The North, tired of the struggle and disengaged from the problem, looked the other way. Reconstruction, that ambitious attempt to refound the country, did not fail for lack of ideas. It failed because what had been won was not protected. Because the country gave in to pressure, chose stability over justice, and allowed racism to return disguised as law. But even so, it left its mark. The constitutional amendments remained there, like dormant seeds, and decades later they would be revived by new generations of activists who understood that the struggle for freedom had not ended. It had simply gone into pause. Meanwhile, the nation, still healing, turned its gaze elsewhere. Toward the rivers where money flowed, toward the factories that grew like hives of iron, toward the cities where smoke replaced the sky. The racial conflict persisted, but it was no longer the center of public debate. A new stage was approaching, just as unequal, just as dangerous. A stage marked by dizzying growth, extreme inequality, and a new kind of war, the war of capital. Because the reconstruction of the country was not only political, it was also economic, and those who knew how to adapt to that new order were the ones who dictated the rules of the next century. Empire under construction. When the war ended, when the smoke cleared and the nation tried to mend its fractures with laws, speeches, and broken promises, a much quieter yet equally powerful force emerged: the machinery of money. In just a few years, the United States transformed from a rural country fractured by civil war into an economic powerhouse with a speed that astonished the world. It was a profound, almost violent transformation, achieved not through parliamentary agreements or epic battles, but through the invisible labor of millions, the accumulated power of a few, and an almost religious faith in limitless growth. Between the year 1870 and the year 1900, the country turned toward industry with a hunger that had no precedent in its history. Factories were built, steel bridges, railroads that crossed entire continents, and cities that grew faster than their capacity to sustain them. Iron, oil, and coal became the new weapons. The old plantations of the South lost prominence to the industrial centers of the North and Midwest. Pittsburgh became synonymous with steel. Chicago reinvented itself after a devastating fire and became a symbol of modernity. New York stopped being just a port and turned into the financial heart of the hemisphere. Behind this transformation were names that became synonymous with power. Andrew Carnegie with steel, John D. Rockefeller with oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt with railroads, and John Pierpont Morgan with banking. They were men with an extraordinary ability to detect opportunity, reorganize markets, crush their competitors, and build economic empires at a time when regulations were minimal, and the law often arrived too late, or did not arrive at all. They were called captains of industry by those who admired their genius, and robber barons by those who suffered the consequences of their ambition. The wealth of these magnates reached such levels that by comparison, European kings looked like modest landowners. But that wealth did not fall from the sky. Behind every million accumulated were thousands of workers laboring through exhausting shifts, children who lost their childhoods in mines and factories, women exploited without labor rights, newly arrived immigrants who accepted any condition just to survive. Industrialization was not merely a technical process. It was a daily war for survival in an environment where capital held all the advantages, and human dignity was, more often than not, an unaffordable luxury. Millions of people arrived from Europe seeking a better life. Irish, Italians, Poles, Jews, Germans, Slavs. Some fled hunger, others fled political or religious persecution. The port of New York welcomed them with promises of freedom. But as soon as they set foot on land, they discovered that freedom was relative. Many crowded into miserable neighborhoods, in apartments without ventilation or running water, living on the edge, exposed to disease, accidents, and the hostility of a society that needed them, but never fully accepted them. In the South, the situation was no better. African Americans, freed from the yoke of slavery, remained trapped in a system that changed its appearance, but not its essence. Sharecropping replaced direct slavery. Former slaves worked other people's land, indebted for life, with no real access to education or justice. Racial segregation laws hardened, and lynchings became a tool of social control. The message was clear. Yes, the country was rebuilding, but it was doing so under the terms of those who had always held power. Despite that oppressive panorama, the first organized responses began to take shape. Labor unions were born in the noise of machines, strikes, and factory smoke. Labor protests were repressed with such brutality that there was no room for doubt. In the year 1886, the Haymarket strike in Chicago ended with a bomb, deaths on both sides, and a wave of repression that marked the entire labor movement. But the spirit of resistance did not die. It grew. It learned to move between the cracks of the system, to use journalism, the vote, public denunciation, and in some cases, clandestine organization. Industrial violence was not the only symptom of a nation in turmoil. The countryside was also in revolt. Small farmers in the Midwest, suffocated by debt, taxes, and prices, manipulated by large railroads and banks, began to organize. The populist movement emerged, demanding a fairer economy, control over monopolies, and the return of politics to the hands of the people. It was a cry from the country's heartland, an attempt to resist the unstoppable tide of capital. Meanwhile, cities grew without planning, mixing wealth and misery on the same block. Poor neighborhoods stood just a few streets away from marble mansions, and inequality was as visible as it was painful. The first investigative journalists were born, those known as muckrakers, who uncovered the horrors hidden behind the facade of progress. Meatpacking industries selling rotten meat, housing infested with rats, politicians bought by large corporations. Yes, the country was growing, but its conscience was beginning to awaken. At the same time, the discourse of progress was being mixed with a new ambition. the ambition to look outward. It was no longer enough to control the continental territory. Businessmen wanted new markets, politicians sought external glory, and military leaders warned about the need for a strong navy. People spoke of historic destiny, of cultural superiority, of a supposed civilizing responsibility. It was the same narrative that decades earlier had driven the conquest of the West, but now it had an international reach. The United States was beginning to prepare for a new stage. Its economic power allowed it to influence far beyond its borders. Its ruling class understood that capital recognized no geographical limits, and internal tensions, though intense, were seen as part of the price of success. The nation was changing, and those who resisted that change were dragged by a current that seemed impossible to stop. Behind every building erected, every kilometer of railroad laid, every mine exploited, there was a story of ambition, sacrifice, and often abuse. But there was also something more: the emergence of a new form of power, more abstract, more technical, more systematic. A power that did not speak in fiery speeches, but in balance sheets, mergers, and dividends. The power of organized capital. And that power, more than any other, would become the great protagonist of the century that was just beginning to dawn. As the industrial machinery perfected itself, the country acquired a double identity: a land of opportunity for those who knew how to play by the system's rules, and a silent nightmare for those born on the wrong side. Freedom remained the national emblem. But as always, the price of that freedom was not the same for everyone. And while some celebrated the achievements of progress, others prepared, from the shadows, to question it. Because no economic empire can grow without provoking questions. And in America, questions do not take long to become struggle. A war to become a global power. There was a latent anxiety in the air. The American industrial machinery no longer found limits within its own borders. The great magnates, Pentagon strategists, and diplomats began to look toward the sea with a mix of ambition and desire. For decades, the United States had been a country expanding inward, devouring its own continental territory. But by the end of the 19th century, that phase seemed exhausted. The map was already complete. The railroad lines already connected the Atlantic to the Pacific. The great rivers had already been exploited. And then, a new question emerged. Silent, but dangerous. What now? For many, the answer was clear. The time had come to look beyond, to act on the international stage. The discourse was always the same, coated in nobility and moral duty. To bring civilization to backward peoples, to protect commercial interests, to secure maritime routes, to combat tyranny. But behind those lofty words, the real engine was economic. Factories needed new markets. Investors demanded new frontiers. And military strategists wanted naval bases, strategic islands, secure ports from which to project American power across the world. It was in that climate that the conflict erupted which would mark the definitive entry of the United States onto the global stage, the Spanish-American War. The year was 1898. The exhausted Spanish Empire still held a few colonial possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. Cuba, in particular, was a jewel coveted by many interests. Its sugar, its strategic position, its geographic proximity, made it too tempting a piece to leave in foreign hands. For years, Cubans had fought for their independence, facing fierce repression by the Spanish government. And the United States, watching closely, saw an opportunity in that struggle. On February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor. More than 200 sailors died. It was never clearly proven who was responsible, but the sensationalist press, led by the powerful newspapers of William Randolph Hearst, used the incident to ignite popular fury. "Remember the Maine," shouted the headlines. War became inevitable. And although the conflict lasted only a few months, its impact was deep and lasting. The United States quickly defeated a Spanish empire already in decline. The battles in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and especially the Philippines sealed the victory. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, Spain ceded control of its colonies. Cuba became a nominally independent republic, but under strong American tutelage. Puerto Rico and Guam were directly incorporated, and the Philippines became a U.S. possession after a payment of $20 million. In less than a year, the United States had gone from being a continental power to an empire with overseas colonies. The occupation of the Philippines was particularly bloody. The Filipinos, who had fought for years against Spain, expected to receive independence after the European empire's defeat. But Washington had other plans. When Filipino leaders realized that the American flag did not mean freedom, but a continuation of colonialism, war broke out. A brutal war, long silenced, in which tactics of repression included concentration camps, torture, summary executions, and the systematic burning of villages. It is estimated that more than 200,000 Filipino civilians died. The justification was always the same: to civilize, to stabilize, to modernize. But what was imposed was fear, control, and obedience. This was the true imperial baptism of the United States. And although it officially continued to present itself as a democratic republic and defender of liberty, the reality showed a country capable of using its power to conquer, subdue, and exploit. Critical voices did not take long to arise. Writers like Mark Twain, politicians like William Jennings Bryan, and activists from all corners denounced the expansionist turn of the country. They founded the Anti-Imperialist League and warned that by acquiring colonies, the United States was betraying the principles on which it had been founded. But the dominant current was another. The Big Stick policy, promoted by President Theodore Roosevelt, summed up the new attitude: speak diplomatically, but be willing to use force. Under his administration, dominance over the Caribbean was consolidated. Military interventions took place in multiple Latin American republics, and the construction of the Panama Canal was promoted, a titanic undertaking that would forever transform global geopolitics. The Monroe Doctrine, born decades earlier to prevent European interference, was reinterpreted as a blank check for intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the country continued to change internally. The economy kept growing, but so did inequalities. Cities became denser, labor more specialized, and social conflicts more visible. The 20th century was approaching with promises and threats. Electricity lit up the streets. The automobile began to roll. Cinema began to tell stories. It was a time of innovation, but also of concentration of power. And although the empire was still young, it already showed signs of wear within. The veterans of the war against Spain returned home with the glory of victory, but also with open wounds and difficult questions. What does it mean to fight for freedom when it is denied to others? Where does defense end and conquest begin? The answers were never clear and were often conveniently forgotten. What is certain is that after 1898, the United States could no longer pretend it was an isolated nation, detached from the global game. It had crossed a line, and on the other side awaited a turbulent, competitive, and dangerous world. In the following decades, that empire in the making would consolidate its power through a mixture of economic influence, military pressure, and pragmatic diplomacy. Military bases multiplied. Political interventions in Latin America became routine, and control over territories like Puerto Rico or the Philippines was presented as a civilizing burden, a way to extend the values of democracy, even when those territories had no voice or vote. In that context of expansion, the country's identity began to be reshaped. It was no longer enough to be a beacon of freedom inward. Now, that light had to be projected outward, even if at times it looked more like a surveillance spotlight than a torch of hope. The debate between ideals and interests intensified, and although pragmatism often won, moral tensions never entirely disappeared. What had begun as a response to an explosion in a harbor ended up marking the beginning of a new era, the era of global power. And although the country was not yet the absolute superpower it would become, it had already learned to act like one. The imperial machinery was in motion, and its gears were starting to turn with force. From that moment on, every distant conflict, every disputed territory, every emerging market would become a board on which the United States would have something to say, or something to claim. Because the world had changed, and America had decided not to watch from the shore, but to dive into the heart of the current. The First World War and the illusion of peace. The 20th century had begun with the United States as a young power, eager to find its place among the great nations. It was no longer the timid republic of previous decades, but a country that had extended its arms beyond the continent, that had learned to use force to exert influence, and that saw in its industrial power a key to open any door. But the world it was stepping into was far from being an orderly board. In Europe, alliances were strained, empires competed in a sickening arms race, and nationalism boiled in the streets like a cauldron about to explode. And when it finally did, the United States was too far to be struck by the first blows, but not far enough to stay out of it forever. The First World War began in the year 1914 as a regional conflict in the Balkans, but it quickly expanded, dragging the main European powers into an unprecedented spiral of destruction. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on one side. On the other, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and Italy. The map turned into a slaughterhouse of trenches, barbed wire, poisonous gas, and millions of young men buried under the mud of a modern, absurd, and prolonged war. In that hellish landscape, the United States watched with caution. At first, the government of Woodrow Wilson remained neutral. The official policy was non-intervention, but that neutrality was more symbolic than real. The United States began selling weapons, supplies, and food to the Allied powers, and its economy flourished with the rhythm of the conflict. Factories worked non-stop, banks granted million-dollar loans, and shipyards operated at full speed. The war in Europe fueled the American capitalist engine, and for many businessmen, it was the business of the century. But distance and neutrality offered no guarantees. In the year 1915, the sinking of the British ship Lusitania, torpedoed by a German submarine, killed more than 1,000 people, including 128 American citizens. It was a turning point. The press reacted with fury. Public opinion began to shift. And although Wilson still resisted, knowing that a war would cost him political capital, events kept pushing the country toward the abyss. In the year 1917, the situation changed radically. Germany resumed its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships without warning. And then, an intercepted telegram, the famous Zimmermann telegram, revealed that Germany was trying to persuade Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for the recovery of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The outrage was immediate. In April of that year, Congress approved the declaration of war. The United States, at last, entered the European conflict. The American participation was brief but decisive. 2 million soldiers crossed the Atlantic. They arrived late but fresh, well-armed, with a morale that contrasted sharply with the desperation of the European armies. The arrival of these reinforcements tipped the balance. In November of the year 1918, Germany requested an armistice. The war was over. More than 17 million dead. Europe in ruins. Empires destroyed. And the United States, untouched on its own soil, richer, stronger, and more influential than ever. At the peak of victory, President Wilson believed it was his moment. At the Paris Peace Conference, he presented an ambitious program of 14 points aimed at rebuilding the world from scratch. He proposed an end to secret alliances, respect for the right of peoples to self-govern, the reduction of armaments, and above all the creation of an international organization to guarantee peace, the League of Nations. For Wilson, this was the final act of a moral crusade. By intervening, the United States had not only won the war, it had also earned the right to reshape the global order. But the old empires were not willing to give in so easily. France and the United Kingdom demanded severe punishments for Germany. They wanted economic reparations, territorial losses, humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles was a toxic mix of revenge and diplomacy. Germany was forced to accept total guilt for the war, to pay astronomical sums, to demilitarize its industry. The seeds of a new tragedy had already been sown. And while the Europeans signed with resentment, back home Wilson faced an unexpected obstacle. The United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. Many senators, especially Republicans, feared that by joining the League of Nations, the United States would lose its sovereignty. They did not want to be bound to foreign wars or treaties that could force the country to intervene without the consent of Congress. Wilson toured the country by train, gave speeches, tried to mobilize public opinion. But he suffered a stroke. He was left partially incapacitated. And with him, his vision also faded. The United States withdrew from the new order it had helped to design. The country turned inward once again. A new era of isolationism began. While Europe tried to rebuild itself on unstable ruins, the United States experienced a decade of euphoria. The 1920s were an explosion of consumerism, modernity, and apparent stability. Silent films filled theaters, jazz played in the bars, and cities were illuminated with electric lights. It was the age of skyscrapers, of the affordable automobile, of women cutting their hair, smoking in public, and demanding the vote. The American dream seemed more real than ever. But beneath the surface, society trembled. The war had left deep psychological wounds. Veterans returned with poorly understood trauma, and many felt the country they returned to no longer had a place for them. Nativist movements multiplied, along with anti-immigrant rhetoric and surveillance of the so-called internal enemy. The fear of communism, fueled by the Russian Revolution, unleashed a wave of repression known as the First Red Scare. Arbitrary detentions, mass deportations, and a toxic atmosphere of paranoia. Freedom, so celebrated in wartime speeches, now seemed more fragile than ever. The post-war period also deepened racial divisions. Thousands of African Americans who had served in the army expected their participation to grant them real rights, recognition, and respect. Instead, they faced lynchings, discrimination, and new segregationist laws. In the year 1919, racial riots broke out in multiple cities. It was called the Red Summer, not for political ideologies, but for the blood spilled in the streets. The message was brutal. The peace signed in Europe had not translated into justice at home. In parallel, movements emerged that sought to redefine the country. The suffrage movement achieved a historic victory in the year 1920, when women won the right to vote. At the same time, prohibition was established. The sale and consumption of alcohol were declared illegal. A moralist measure that ultimately fueled organized crime, clandestine bars, and a new urban culture. The law tried to control excesses, but produced the opposite effect. The country lived in a constant contradiction between imposed order and the desire for freedom. The United States had intervened in the greatest war in history up to that point, but its role in the peace was ambiguous, even frustrating. Wilson's dream of a fair and balanced world was devoured by the old logic of power, revenge, and control. What remained was an illusion, the illusion that the war had served any purpose beyond redistributing power among winners and losers. And yet, something had changed forever. The country could no longer pretend to be a distant republic, disconnected from global conflicts. Its economy, its diplomacy, its capacity for influence placed it inevitably at the center of the board. Even if many resisted, the path to hegemony was already drawn. It would only take a new crisis, deeper, more devastating, to reveal it without ambiguity. Wild years and total collapse. When the war was left behind, the country surrendered itself to a collective euphoria that seemed to erase every trace of suffering. It was as if all the pain accumulated on the European battlefields needed to be released in a single burst, in the brightly lit streets, in the new musical rhythms, in the fast cars racing down freshly paved avenues, in the dizzying rise of a society that wanted to convince itself that the worst was over and that the future belonged to it by right. Thus were born the so-called wild years, a decade marked by frenzy, innovation, and blind confidence that progress could no longer be stopped. The 1920s were a spectacle of lights, smoke, and promises. Jazz became the soundtrack of a youth that defied the old rules. Women cut their skirts, their hair, and their silence. Cities grew upward into the sky. Skyscrapers defied gravity and symbolized the rise of a nation that saw itself as invincible. Wall Street was the new temple, and stockbrokers were the priests of a modern cult whose god was fast, multiplied money. Factories continued to roar. Electricity reached millions of homes. Henry Ford's automobile was no longer a luxury, but a democratic symbol of mobility. Silent cinema became an industry, a myth, a window into possible worlds. Radio brought the human voice to every corner of the country. And in the midst of all that, the stock market became a stage where anyone, at least in appearance, could become rich with just a few correct moves. It was a frenzied dance that promised universal wealth, where risk disguised itself as opportunity. But beneath that dazzling surface, the country was full of cracks. Wealth was not distributed fairly. While a few accumulated unimaginable fortunes, the majority survived on precarious wages and exhausting workdays. Agriculture, which had sustained the country for centuries, was entering a silent crisis. Millions of farmers were in debt, trapped by low prices and a lack of government support. Accelerated industrialization had left entire regions behind, and the gap between the brightness of the cities and the darkness of the countryside grew deeper with each passing year. Society became polarized. Prohibition, imposed since the year 1920, aimed to curb alcohol consumption, but instead fueled a violent and clandestine underworld. Hidden bars emerged. Powerful mafias rose. Police officers were corrupted. Organized crime became part of the urban landscape. Al Capone became an icon of an era where illegality was profitable, and the government looked the other way. Public morality hardened at the same pace that private life grew more unrestrained. It was a double standard that could be felt everywhere. Racism did not disappear with modernity. In the South, segregation laws remained in effect, reinforced by lynchings and constant threats. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a new stage of growth and expanded even into the North, disguising its hatred with speeches about patriotism and family values. Racial tensions intensified, and although cultural movements such as the Harlem Renaissance emerged, celebrating African American identity through literature, music, and thought, discrimination remained a solid wall, difficult to tear down. Meanwhile, the financial system was inflating like a balloon. Easy credit, uncontrolled speculation, the purchase of stocks with borrowed money, and the irrational confidence that prices would rise forever. All of it created a bubble that no one wanted to see, or that many saw and preferred to ignore. The government, controlled by business interests and an ideology of laissez-faire, avoided intervening. It was believed that the market corrected itself, that economic cycles were part of the natural order. But the natural order also includes earthquakes. And the earthquake came. On the 24th of October of the year 1929, a Thursday that became etched in collective memory as Black Thursday, the market collapsed. Stocks plummeted. Panic spread. The following day, the fall was even worse, and the same continued in the days that followed. In a matter of weeks, millions of people lost their savings, their jobs, their homes. Entire banks went bankrupt. Businesses shut down overnight. The Great Depression had begun, dragging with it the illusions of an entire decade. What followed was the accelerated breakdown of the social fabric. Unemployment lines snaked through the streets. Entire families were evicted from their homes. Neighborhoods of makeshift huts rose, known as Hoovervilles, in ironic reference to President Herbert Hoover, whose response to the disaster was weak, delayed, and incapable of halting the catastrophe. Desperation became routine. Suicides increased. Hunger returned. Internal migrations multiplied. Many traveled across the country in search of work, of bread, of something. But in the midst of that darkness, a figure emerged who would change the course of United States history: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Elected president in the year 1932, he came to power with a mix of charisma, determination, and political clarity rarely seen in the country's history. He promised a New Deal to pull the nation back from the abyss. And although his policies did not solve everything immediately, they marked a radical shift in the relationship between the government and society. The New Deal was a set of social, economic, and labor programs that redefined government intervention. Agencies were created to protect workers, guarantee unemployment insurance, promote public works, and regulate the financial system. Social Security was established. Investments were made in infrastructure, and for the first time, an idea that seemed revolutionary was promoted: that the government had the responsibility to protect its citizens from the crises of the market. Not everyone supported these measures. More conservative sectors saw them as a step toward socialism. The most powerful business owners feared losing control. But for millions of ordinary citizens, the New Deal was a lifeline, a sign that someone in power cared about those who had fallen. Roosevelt spoke directly to the people through the radio, in his famous fireside chats. His voice transmitted calm, confidence, and for years, it was one of the few certainties in a nation plunged into uncertainty. The crisis also changed how the people of the United States saw themselves. For the first time, the American dream appeared vulnerable. It was not enough to work hard. It was not enough to show initiative. The system could fail, and when it did, it dragged everyone down with it, without distinction. The old formulas no longer worked. Everything had to be reinvented: politics, the economy, the relationship between social classes, between the individual and the state. And while the country tried to rise again, in other parts of the world new storms were brewing. Europe had not recovered from the trauma of the war. Germany was suffering under the weight of reparations, resentment, and unemployment. In Italy, fascism had come to power. In Japan, militarism was growing. The extremes began to take over. And although the United States tried to stay on the sidelines, history would soon call again. This time, with a force that would forever change the nation's position in the world. The Second World War and absolute power. It all began with a spark that seemed distant. In Europe, just like the last time. But this time, the fire spread with brutal speed, as if the world had learned nothing from the previous disaster. Hitler, emboldened by German resentment and the power vacuums left by the Treaty of Versailles, began his escalation with Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and finally invaded Poland. It was September of the year 1939, and the continent was once again stained with blood. The United States once more adopted a posture of watchful neutrality, but deep down, it knew that this balance could not last long. The entire planet was shaking, and soon the storm would reach it too. During the early years, while France fell, while London was shrouded in smoke under German bombings, while fascism spread like a plague through Europe and Asia, the United States lived in a state of restrained tension. President Roosevelt understood that this was not just another conflict, that what was at stake was not merely a reshuffling of borders, but the very soul of the century. That is why, even without declaring war, he began preparing. The arms industry was strengthened, the Lend-Lease Act was signed to support the Allies, and the Navy was reinforced. It was as if the country was walking along the edge of an abyss, refusing to jump, yet knowing there would ultimately be no other choice. The attack came, unexpected and devastating. On the 7th of December of the year 1941, Japanese planes bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. More than 2,000 American soldiers died in a single day. Neutrality died with them. The next day, Congress declared war on the Japanese Empire, and shortly after, also on Germany and Italy. Now the nation was in it, not as an observer or a secondary force, but as a main player in the most colossal war humanity had ever faced. The United States was transformed immediately. The entire industrial apparatus, which was still recovering from the Great Depression, became a war machine. Factories that once made cars, household appliances, or farm equipment began producing tanks, airplanes, and ammunition. Women entered the workforce en masse, taking up roles that had previously been denied to them. Rosie the Riveter was not just a propaganda poster. She was the face of a social revolution. Rationing was imposed, war bonds were sold, and military training centers were created across the country. The entire nation aligned behind a total cause. The war was fought on two fronts. In Europe, American troops landed first in North Africa, then in Italy, and finally in Normandy, on the historic day of the 6th of June of the year 1944, D-Day. The French beaches turned red with blood, but it marked the beginning of the Nazi retreat. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the fight against Japan was even more brutal. Battles like Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were desperate, bloody confrontations where every meter gained cost thousands of lives. The war was not heroic, it was a daily slaughter. But surrender was never an option. The Allied advance in Europe allowed for the liberation of the concentration camps. What was discovered there paralyzed the world. Millions of Jews, Roma people, homosexuals, and political prisoners had been systematically exterminated in places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The Holocaust was not a rumor. It was a machine of death that had operated for years under the shadow of silence. The liberation of those camps changed forever the way humanity conceived evil. And for many, it also justified the need to have fought that war with the full weight of power. In May of the year 1945, Germany surrendered. Hitler had taken his own life in his bunker. Berlin was a city in ruins. The war in Europe was over. But in the Pacific, Japan still resisted, with an obstinacy that seemed suicidal. That was when the United States unleashed the weapon that would change the course of history forever: the atomic bomb. On the 6th of August, Hiroshima was wiped off the map in seconds. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. More than 200,000 people died, some instantly, others slowly, amidst flames, rubble, and radiation. The decision to drop those bombs remains one of the most debated in history. Some justify it as a way to avoid an invasion that would have cost millions of lives. Others condemn it as an unnecessary act, motivated more by a desire to demonstrate power than by military necessity. What is certain is that it marked a before and after. Japan surrendered, the war ended, but the world entered a new era, the nuclear age. At the end of the conflict, the United States emerged as the undisputed superpower. Europe was in ruins. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people. China was fragmented. Washington became the political, economic, and military center of the planet. The dollar was consolidated as the global currency. The economy experienced an unprecedented boom. The United Nations was founded, and a new world order began to take shape, with the United States at its head. However, victory also left internal wounds. Soldiers returned home with deep psychological trauma. The country had to reintegrate them into civilian life, create jobs, provide education, and build housing. Thus, the middle class as we know it today was born. Suburbs multiplied, highways were built, and mass consumption took hold. The family, the television, the refrigerator, the personal car, these became part of the new American ideal. But that ideal was not accessible to everyone. African Americans who had fought in Europe and the Pacific returned to a country that still denied them basic rights. Women, who had proven essential to industry, were pushed back into the home. Racism persisted, as did gender inequality. There was a latent tension between the official story of success and the cracks that same story tried to hide. And at the same time, a new, more diffuse, more ideological threat was emerging: communism. The world was no longer the same. The war had transformed every aspect of life. But the most unsettling thing was that only a few months after the last shot was fired, the next conflict was already taking shape. This time, not with conventional weapons, but with missiles capable of destroying the planet. And so, even as they celebrated victory, Americans began looking up to the sky, to the east, to the Iron Curtain that was beginning to fall over Europe, and wondering if peace had only been a pause. The Cold War freezes the world. When the cannons fell silent and the dust of the Second World War began to settle, no one could say for certain whether what had ended was a war or simply the bloodiest phase of a new confrontation still waiting to define itself. Because although the Allies had won together, the alliance was more circumstantial than sincere. The distrust, carefully masked during the years of combat, emerged with force the moment the celebrations ended. And that was when the planet split into two halves. One that promised freedom and democracy under the banner of the United States, and another that vowed justice and equality under the iron command of the Soviet Union. It was the Cold War. A war without formal battles, but with armies ready to unleash the end of the world. A war of speeches, of threats, of invisible movements. A total conflict in which what was truly being disputed was the soul of the future. The United States found itself not only as a victor, but as a global watchdog. Its influence extended through Western Europe, Latin America, Asia, and across the seas. But every inch gained in influence was contested by Moscow, which was weaving alliances in Eastern Europe, China, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. On this new board, any spark could ignite everything. The tension translated into frantic races. The arms race, with nuclear arsenals growing out of control. The space race, with satellites, rockets, and the promise of conquering the sky in order to dominate the Earth. And the ideological race, which divided countries, families, and beliefs. Fear became the norm. In the United States, anti-communist paranoia took institutional form. Committees, hearings, and blacklists emerged. Senator Joseph McCarthy fueled a modern witch hunt in which actors, intellectuals, professors, and even government officials were accused of sympathizing with the enemy. In that stifling atmosphere, the country began to live two overlapping realities. On one side, an era of material splendor. Factories operated at full capacity, wages were high, entire suburban neighborhoods were built, and millions of families bought their first television. It was the rise of the middle class. The American dream turned into a daily routine for many. The concept of the teenager as a social identity emerged. Consumption increased, highways connected states, and everything seemed to move steadily toward a future of abundance. But on the other side of that shining mirror, something did not add up. structural racism remained deeply entrenched. In many states, especially in the South, African Americans were second-class citizens, excluded from schools, neighborhoods, and the ballot box. And although some progressive sectors had begun to challenge that order, resistance was fierce. A gender gap also persisted, limiting women's access to important positions or economic autonomy. And beyond the borders, United States foreign policy became increasingly aggressive, more determined to intervene wherever it perceived a red threat. In the year 1950, tension erupted in Asia. Korea, divided at the end of the war between the Communist North and the South, allied with the West, became the stage for a fierce war. United States troops, under the umbrella of the United Nations, fought for 3 years in a conflict that left millions dead and a country divided to this day. It was the first real test of the containment doctrine, to prevent communism from advancing even one more step, even if that cost thousands of lives. Fear intensified when, in the year 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. For the United States, it was more than a technological sign. It was a warning. If they could launch a satellite, they could launch missiles. If they dominated space, they dominated the world. The response was immediate. NASA was created. Billions of dollars were invested in scientific education, research, and development. The space race was, in reality, a Cold War in orbit. And while the sky filled with satellites, on Earth conflicts multiplied. Vietnam was beginning to stir with a war that did not yet have a clear face, but that would soon consume generations. In Latin America, coups were supported to stop governments suspected of communist sympathies. The Central Intelligence Agency intervened in Iran, in Guatemala, and in many other places. Foreign policy turned pragmatic, leaving no room for ideals, where stability, understood as alignment with Washington, mattered more than democracy. One of the most critical moments came in the year 1962. Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, had become a declared ally of the Soviet Union. When intelligence services discovered that the island was hosting Soviet nuclear missiles, the world held its breath. For 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the planet to the brink of nuclear war. Humanity hung by a thread as thin as the patience of 2 men, John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. In the end, negotiation prevailed. Moscow withdrew its missiles, and the United States promised not to invade the island. But the fear was seared into memory. And yet, amid that tense context, winds of transformation could also be felt. The civil rights movements were beginning to gain strength. In Washington, in Montgomery, in Birmingham, the protests were growing. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Voices that demanded a different America, an America that would live up to its own promises. The Cold War was not only about missiles and diplomacy, it was also an internal war, a battle to define who had the right to be part of the American dream. The contrast was striking. While the news talked about technological progress, economic growth, and the fight against communism, in the streets, on university campuses, and in the poorest neighborhoods, frustration was in the air. Prosperity was not reaching everyone. Urban ghettos expanded. The economic gap widened. Politics became increasingly conservative, but younger generations began to question everything: the government, the war, the system. The 1960s were about to explode. The United States was a powerful nation, respected, feared, but it was also a nation in constant tension. Because the Cold War was not only a clash between 2 opposing ideologies, it was also a mirror. And when looking into it, many began to see their own contradictions. The country that defended freedom abroad had not yet resolved its internal debts of justice, and that gap, as the years went by, would become impossible to ignore. The struggle for civil rights. There was a promise written from the very beginning, signed with solemnity by the Founding Fathers, repeated endlessly in speeches and textbooks, that all men were created equal. But for nearly 2 centuries, that phrase was a declaration without flesh or justice for millions of people who were born, lived, and died in a country that kept them outside the social contract. The struggle for civil rights was not an organized march or a single heroic act. It was a long, exhausting, deeply human war, made up of small gestures and actions that changed history. It was America confronting its own reflection. The end of the Second World War had left many questions unanswered. African American soldiers who had fought in Europe returned home only to find that their uniforms did not protect them from humiliation or the law. The signs at train stations still separated whites and blacks. Schools remained divided, neighborhoods were hostile, and the ballot boxes were locked behind legal mechanisms and physical threats. The South of the United States was a carefully crafted legal system of segregation, and the North, though less explicit, remained trapped in structural prejudice that limited access to housing, employment, and education. In that suffocating landscape, the spark did not come from a great leader or an office in Washington. It came from a woman sitting on a bus. Rosa Parks, a seamstress, activist, and citizen of Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat to a white man. She did not shout. She did not raise a weapon. She simply said no with her whole being. Her arrest triggered a wave of outrage that unleashed a massive boycott of the public transportation system. For more than a year, thousands of African Americans walked under the sun, in the rain, in despair, defying daily exhaustion with a resistance that was never passive. And from that boycott, a name emerged that would soon become a symbol: Martin Luther King Jr. King was a young pastor, with a firm voice and a message that resonated with ancient strength. Resistance had to be nonviolent, inspired by Gandhi, moved by Christian principles and by an unbreakable ethical conviction. But that nonviolence did not mean meekness. It was a weapon of impact. To face brutality with dignity, to show the country and the world the wounds that refused to heal. Every march, every sit-in, every speech was a declaration of moral war against the system. As the 1950s moved into the 1960s, the civil rights movement began to take center stage in the national conversation. Television cameras showed images that had previously been invisible. Children facing police officers, elderly women soaked by water cannons, young people dragged through the streets for asking for coffee at a forbidden counter. It was impossible to keep looking away. The case of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy brutally murdered in Mississippi, and whose mother insisted on displaying his mutilated body in an open casket, shocked the entire country. He was not a symbol, he was a child. And his face said more than 1,000 speeches. In the year 1954, the Supreme Court had issued a historic ruling in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. School segregation was unconstitutional. But change did not come with applause. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 African American students had to be escorted by the army just to enter a school. White crowds insulted them, spat on them, threw objects at them. The law had changed, but the heart of the country still resisted accepting it. During the first half of the 1960s, the confrontations grew more intense. The Freedom Rides, caravans of activists traveling through the South on integrated buses, were brutally attacked. In Birmingham, peaceful demonstrators were beaten and jailed. In Washington, in August of 1963, more than 200,000 citizens gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial to hear Martin Luther King deliver his most remembered speech. "I have a dream." His words echoed like a call from another time, but also as a demand for the present. And that present was about to erupt. The murders marked the calendar. In 1963, a church in Birmingham was bombed by white supremacists. 4 little girls died. The following year, the bodies of 3 voting rights activists were found buried in an embankment. One of them was white, and that ignited even more national outrage. The pressure was immense. Finally, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation in public spaces and required equality in employment. 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act was signed, eliminating many of the barriers that had prevented African Americans from voting. It seemed like a victory, but the struggle was far from over. In urban neighborhoods, unemployment, poverty, police brutality, and discrimination remained common. New voices emerged, more impatient, more radical. Malcolm X, with his fierce critique of white hypocrisy and his defense of black pride. The Black Panthers, with their community patrols, school breakfast programs, and armed resistance against state abuses. Unity was beginning to fracture, but the cause remained alive. It was no longer just a struggle for civil rights. It was a struggle for the soul of the country. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. His death was a deep wound. Riots broke out in more than 100 cities. The country was burning. And in that chaos, many began to wonder whether the American dream could survive the awakening of its own contradictions. The civil rights movement was not a linear process, nor a definitive victory. It was a turning point. What it achieved was to push the nation toward an uncomfortable but necessary truth: that equality is not a gift, but a debt. That progress is not measured by written laws, but by the lives that change. And that freedom, to be real, must be shared. Because a nation divided by color, class, or fear can only walk in circles, and there were still many more roads to travel. The American dream begins to crack. At the dawn of the 1970s, the United States was no longer the same country that had once presented itself to the world as a champion of freedom and prosperity. The legacy of the Cold War weighed heavily. The blood spilled in Vietnam stained the morality of an entire generation, and the great promises of progress seemed to fade like smoke between skyscrapers. The American dream, that carefully constructed narrative built over decades, was beginning to show its seams, and behind them emerged a society that was distrustful, exhausted, and increasingly divided. Vietnam became the backdrop of an entire era. What began as a distant conflict in defense of an ideology ended up as an open wound in the national conscience. As soldiers returned in coffins draped in flags, while the death toll rose with no clear victory in sight, the American people began to question everything: foreign policy, presidential authority, even the legitimacy of the system that demanded blind faith. Protests multiplied on college campuses, in public squares, and on streets filled with young people who no longer feared repression. It was a youth that shouted its rejection with signs, with music, with bodies lying before the cameras. The shooting at Kent State, where the National Guard killed 4 students during a peaceful protest, made it clear that the conflict was not just in Asia. It was burning at home too. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, the erosion was evident. Richard Nixon, elected with promises of order and peace, would become the central figure in one of the deepest political scandals in American history. Watergate was much more than hidden microphones in an office. It became the symbol of systemic corruption, of a distrust that stretched from the highest levels of government to the humblest homes. When Nixon resigned in 1974, taking his cabinet with him, the country did not celebrate. It sighed in exhaustion. The idea that the system could correct itself was tainted by permanent suspicion. It was no longer a question of whether leaders were good or bad. It was about whether anyone could believe in them at all. In this context of political crisis, the country was also hit by an economic blow. The energy crisis of 1973, caused by the oil embargo imposed by Arab countries, shook the very foundations of the American economy. Fuel prices skyrocketed. Factories began to shut down. Unemployment rose. and a new word entered everyday vocabulary: stagflation. It was a lethal combination of high inflation and economic stagnation. For the first time in decades, the future did not appear as an upward line, but as a dark maze where certainty crumbled. The social response to this collapse was diverse, contradictory, and visceral. On one hand, movements emerged demanding deep transformation: feminists fighting for abortion rights and equal pay, environmentalists warning about the limits of infinite growth, minorities denouncing structural racism not as a remnant of the past, but as a daily reality. On the other hand, a conservative backlash was growing, accusing these struggles of fragmenting the nation, endangering traditional values, and tearing apart the social fabric. And it was precisely on that wave of disillusionment that the figure of Ronald Reagan emerged. Actor, charismatic communicator, former governor of California, Reagan knew how to interpret the mood of a large portion of the country, that yearning to believe again in a strong, triumphant America capable of reclaiming its shine. His arrival to the presidency in the year 1981 marked the beginning of a new era. Under the slogan that "government is the problem," he launched an economic revolution based on deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthiest, and the weakening of labor unions. What became known as Reaganism was, for many, a revitalizing force. For others, it was a sentence that deepened inequality. Yes, the economy recovered, but at a high price. Millions of industrial jobs disappeared under the logic of automation and outsourcing. Major cities began to fill with homeless people. The so-called war on drugs, launched with spectacle, led to a wave of mass incarcerations that disproportionately affected African American and Latino communities. The penal system became a business, and the criminalization of poverty was disguised as a security policy. On the international front, Reagan revived the language of confrontation. He labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire, reactivated the arms race, and flirted with the idea of a space-based defense that seemed taken from a science fiction movie: the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. And while tensions began to rise again, something unexpected was happening within the communist bloc. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power with a message of openness and reform. His policies of glasnost and perestroika unleashed an irreversible process that would culminate, a few years later, in the fall of the Berlin Wall. The United States declared itself the victor of the Cold War without having fired a single missile in the end. The decade of the 1980s ended with a strange feeling. On one hand, global supremacy was unquestionable. On the other, internal wounds were deepening. The country had changed how it worked, how it governed, how it believed. The cities had become arenas of brutal inequality. Urban violence was on the rise. AIDS was spreading while institutional indifference silenced thousands of deaths. And the economic model, though applauded by the markets, was creating a world where wealth was concentrated with unprecedented speed. Television and advertising sold an image of success that few could truly attain. The cult of individualism replaced collective commitment. The recent past was wrapped in a thick fog of selective nostalgia and broken promises. Many began to ask whether the American dream, that brilliant tale in which effort always leads to reward, had always been a carefully decorated myth. And yet something still pulsed beneath it all. A persistent idea that things could be remade, that beyond the fractures, it was still possible to reinvent. Because if history had shown anything about the United States up to that point, it was that even when the ground trembled, even when the pillars cracked, there were always those willing to rebuild. And soon, the country would face new tests that would once again put everything on the line. Fallen towers and endless wars. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began with clear skies over New York. It was the kind of day seemingly designed for routine. Crisp suits, coffee in cardboard cups, trains arriving on time. No one suspected that the course of world history was about to change with sudden, almost cinematic violence. yet far too real to be processed in real time. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, Flight 175 struck the South Tower. Cameras captured it all. Disbelief turned to panic, and the entire world held its breath. In the following hours, the symbols of American power were attacked one by one. The Pentagon was struck by another plane. A fourth, intended for the Capitol or the White House, crashed in Pennsylvania thanks to the resistance of its passengers. In just a few hours, nearly 3,000 people were dead. The heart of New York was burning under dust and rubble. The most cosmopolitan city on the planet had turned into a war zone. The towers, once symbols of economic triumph and architectural arrogance, disintegrated into a thick cloud that covered everything: the bodies, the streets, the certainties. In the days that followed, the United States entered a kind of trance. Outrage turned into unity. Unity transformed into determination. The enemy, it was said, was not at home, but out there, lurking in remote caves, in distant deserts, in the shadow of a name that would from then on be spoken with fear and fury: Al-Qaeda, and above all, Osama bin Laden. President George W. Bush wasted no time in declaring a war on terror, an abstract, ambiguous, and nearly infinite concept. The goal was clear: to dismantle terrorist networks, to hunt down those who had planned and executed the attacks. But soon, that mandate became something much larger and far more dangerous. In October of the same year, the United States invaded Afghanistan, the country that had sheltered Al-Qaeda's leadership. The Taliban regime was overthrown in a matter of weeks, but the war, far from ending, entered a prolonged and confusing phase, with no clear end in sight. Television showed columns of tanks, soldiers in night vision goggles, helicopters roaring over mountain villages. The images looked like they had been lifted from another war in another era, but with modern technology. What wasn't shown as clearly was the growing number of civilian casualties, the complexity of an unwinnable occupation, the collapse of any real attempt at reconstruction. Afghanistan, a land of fallen empires, was absorbing resources, lives, and time, without offering any clear victory in return. The years passed. Promises of withdrawal were postponed again and again. The war seemed to have become normalized, as if it were now part of the permanent landscape of U.S. foreign policy. And then, in March of 2003, came another blow: the invasion of Iraq. Backed by arguments repeated ad nauseum, Saddam Hussein's supposed possession of weapons of mass destruction, his alleged ties to terrorist groups, the United States, along with an international coalition, launched a massive offensive. In just a few weeks, Baghdad fell. The regime was dismantled. Hussein was captured. But the power vacuum, the chaos, the accumulated resentment opened the doors to disaster. Iraq became a laboratory of horror. Civil war broke out. Militias emerged. Suicide bombings increased. And in that toxic environment, something even more terrifying was born: the Islamic State. Meanwhile, at home, the consequences of 9/11 were transforming daily life. The Department of Homeland Security was created. Laws like the Patriot Act were passed, greatly expanding the government's surveillance powers. Cameras were installed, airport security intensified, and previously unthinkable practices were legitimized. Warrantless wiretaps, arbitrary detentions, detention centers like Guantanamo, where legal norms seemed to be suspended. The leaked images of torture from Abu Ghraib prison showed a dark side of the U.S. military, contradicting every speech about liberty and human rights. The country entered a new era, an era of fear and hyper-surveillance. Terrorism became the justification for almost every government decision. And while many felt safer, others began to question the real cost of that security. What had been lost along the way? How many individual liberties had been sacrificed? How many lies had been disguised as strategy? The economy also began to feel the strain. The wars cost trillions. Military spending soared, while social and infrastructure sectors weakened. And in 2008, the final blow to that turbulent decade arrived: the financial crisis. But that belongs to another chapter. What was already clear was that 9/11 didn't just change U.S. foreign policy. It changed its inner soul. Its relationship with Islam, with immigrants, with foreigners became tainted by suspicion. Muslim communities were surveilled, profiled, stigmatized. Hate crimes rose. Nationalist rhetoric surged. Resentments that had never really died came back to the surface. And so, the United States entered the 21st century as an empire that now knew it was vulnerable. A country that had won the Cold War without firing the last shot, but had failed to anticipate the new face of its enemies. A country that reacted with strength, but also with fear. And fear, once it settles into institutions, into the streets, into the collective psyche, is hard to dislodge. What came afterward was no longer the story of a confident empire, but of a nation trying to redefine itself amid its own confusion. Yes, the towers fell. But with them, many of the illusions that had sustained an entire era also collapsed. The war on terror was not just a military conflict. At its core, it was a battle over the very meaning of what it means to live in freedom. And that battle, to this day, is far from over. A nation at the crossroads. At the beginning of the 21st century, the United States seemed to move between two opposing forces. On one hand, the still intact power of a nation with unmatched technological, military, and cultural capacity. On the other, the deep cracks of a social body creaking under the weight of its contradictions. Everything it had built over 2 centuries, from its founding ideals to the systems that governed daily life, was beginning to confront an uncomfortable mirror, that of its own fragility. The arrival of Barack Obama to the presidency in the year 2009 was received as a historic moment, not only for its symbolic value, as he was the first African-American president, but for what it promised: a renewed hope amid financial chaos, a new era of unity after wars and divisions, a refreshed image before the world. His speech was elegant, rational, deeply institutional, but also charged with a near-nostalgic faith in what the United States could once again become. And for a time, many believed it was possible. The economic recovery, although unequal, was advancing. The healthcare reform known as Obamacare represented one of the most ambitious attempts to change the relationship between the state and the everyday lives of its citizens. But while that was happening on the surface, other forces stirred beneath. Structural racism, never resolved, began to boil intensely. The attacks against the presidency, disguised as political criticism, carried a barely concealed weight of racial resentment. The murder of Trayvon Martin in the year 2012, and later the cases of Ferguson, Baltimore, and so many others, showed that the promise of equality was still an unfulfilled debt. The Black Lives Matter movement emerged, a collective cry demanding to be heard, a denunciation of systemic violence that had never truly disappeared. But as in many stages of American history, every step forward awakened a counter-reaction, and polarization intensified. In that tense atmosphere, shaped by social media that amplified outrage, disinformation, and anger, the country reached one of the most unexpected turns in its recent political history: the election of Donald Trump in the year 2016. A businessman, media figure, and total outsider from the traditional political establishment, his victory was an earthquake. For millions, he represented a necessary rupture with the elites, with political correctness, with the feeling that the country no longer belonged to those who had built it through sacrifice. Trump embodied a mix of nostalgia for an idealized past, anti-immigrant rhetoric, economic nationalism, and a complete disregard for institutional norms. His presidency was a constant whirlwind: immigration bans, clashes with the press, waves of resignations, and ongoing scandals. And yet, he maintained strong support among a significant part of the electorate. What to some was an authoritarian threat, to others was finally someone who spoke clearly, without filters or hesitation. During his presidency, society became even more binary. Everything was viewed through the lens of black or white, friend or enemy, patriot or traitor. Elections were no longer just democratic processes. They became moral battles. The country was at war with itself. And then, reality struck again with force. In the year 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic paralyzed the world. But in the United States, the health tragedy also became a political and social crisis. Hundreds of thousands of deaths, overwhelmed hospitals, constant disinformation, conspiracy theories, and a government that downplayed the severity while the population became divided even over the use of face masks. The death of George Floyd that same year, recorded on video and viral within hours, triggered massive protests. The streets of major cities filled with rage, pain, and fire. The country burned on multiple fronts, without pause, without truce. Meanwhile, the economy trembled, schools closed, and jobs disappeared. The idea of an unbeatable United States began to dissolve like an illusion from another time. Inequality reached historic levels. Big tech companies accumulated unprecedented power, while millions of people lived on the brink of collapse. The American dream, for many, had become a broken promise. Or worse, a lie. The election of Joe Biden, in a context of extreme tension, was not so much a vote of enthusiasm as a desperate attempt to stabilize the republic. And even so, the assault on the Capitol on the 6th of January in the year 2021 showed that something fundamental had been shattered. Democracy, so often exported through bombs and treaties, revealed its vulnerability before the world's cameras. It was not perfect. It was not invincible. It could bleed. Today, the United States stands at a true, profound, and painful crossroads. Technology has transformed how people inform themselves, communicate, vote, and hate. Racism has not disappeared. The gap between rich and poor continues to widen. Firearms still circulate with a normality that borders on the absurd. And yet, there are also millions of people who believe, who fight, who teach, who dream of rebuilding something better. The history of this country has always been a combination of progress and shadow, of great ideals and terrible contradictions. From the arrival of the first indigenous peoples to today's resistance movements, what has defined the United States is not a straight line of success, but a complex spiral of advances and setbacks, of cries and silences, of glory and pain. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about this country is that its story is never finished. It is in constant revision, like a text being written over and over again, by different hands, from opposing perspectives, amid conflicts that never fully end. And what happens in the coming years, with its elections, its cultural battles, its climate challenges, its technological reinventions, will be another page in that still open history. Because the United States, with all its historical weight, is not a fixed idea. It is a living question, a question still waiting for an answer. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey through the turns, wounds, and contradictions of a nation that is still writing its story. If something you heard made you think, feel, or reflect, let us know in the comments. Your voice also adds to this conversation. And if you enjoy these stories, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Good night.